Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. I want to welcome you to the seventh in a series of roundtable discussions brought to you by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and the Network for Global Innovation. I'm Fred Walty. I'm the CEO of the Network for Global Innovation, and I'm going to be your host and moderator today. You know, the purpose of these discussions really are to raise our collective understanding of the challenges between where we are now and where we got to get to in a carbon neutral future. I'm sure everybody on this webinar is bought into, aggressively agrees with the goal of getting to, a carbon-free economy and world by 2050. But I don't think many of us really understand the how. How are we really going to get there? And that's really the purpose of these discussions. They tend to have two characteristics to them, if you will. We tend to be practical, that's primarily a result of our panelists who are practitioners every day. And it's partly a result of the fact that, of course, we're entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs like to get things done, and we always want to know kind of what's the next step. And we believe that if you just keep doing the next step, you'll eventually get to where you want to go. And the second part of it, of course, is the Network for Global Innovation is a global organization. So we try to bring a world perspective to this. And we do that because we think that if we share ideas and situations around the world, we'll get smarter. We'll get to where we need to go better collectively. Our panelists have been everywhere from Argentina, Brazil, Austria. Today we have a panelist from Nigeria, Italy, India, Mexico. We have a wide range of panelists, and our audience is global in nature. We've had the audience from 24 different countries. Today will be no different. Our audience is generally speaking much larger once we record this discussion and put it out on our social media channels. And so we look forward to having it. Today's discussion is about the transition to a carbon neutral future with 4 words added to it: in a just way. Okay. We're going to talk about the just transition and how do we get to carbon neutrality in a equitable fashion. When I became CEO of the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, I tried to, you always try to have an elevator speech of what your organization is all about. And my elevator speech was, well, we're going to build a clean tech innovation hub in order to create a huge green economy for Los Angeles. My successor, Matt Peterson, added one word to that, one little word, and it made all the difference in the world. And that one little word was, we're going to build an equitable green economy. And that's, I think, where the world is today. I think the world really understands that it's not just enough to get to carbon neutrality, which is a huge thing in and of itself. We have to do it in an equitable, just manner. I thought I would start by defining what the just transition is, because we use that word all the time. And I found a really simple definition, and that is greening the economy in a way that is as fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. So I think it's pretty clear what the objective is. Getting there, however, is a pretty comprehensive, difficult thing. I think it's going to touch every component of our society. It is going to be required. Of course, it means providing the under-resourced, underserved communities with the equal opportunity to have inexpensive, clean energy. It also means, of course, having the underserved, under-resourced be able to participate equally in the job creation opportunities of the green economy. We all know it's growing incredibly rapidly. But the flip side of that is also true. We need to develop mitigation strategies for those who are displaced as we transition to a sustainable future. There are a lot of people working in the fossil fuel business that need to not be left behind. They need to be able to participate in this. So not only do we want to make sure we deliver reduced energy costs and obviously reduce pollution, but we need to make sure economically that everybody has the opportunity as much as possible to participate in this growing future. So why are we talking about solar justice? Why don't we just talk about the just transition overall? And the answer comes back to what these discussions are like. Solar is here. It's now. It's part of what's happening. There are 1,200 gigawatts of solar already installed. It's growing at, I don't know, 25% a year. It has been. It will be for a very long time. Solar justice is as applicable in the developed world, Los Angeles, the US, as it is in the developing world, whether that be Africa, India, Asia. And it is a key strategy in addressing the developing world's big challenge of rural electrification. So we're going to try to talk about this from three perspectives. One, what is solar justice? What does injustice look like? What are some of the causes? Okay. Two, what are the solutions? And the solutions, and we're going to talk about from the perspectives of our panelists. We'll have panelists from the world of the utilities, okay, from the policy and regulation, and from the private side, whether it be in the US multi-family residences or in Africa in rural electrification. So I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. Andrea Leon Grossman, raise your hand, Andrea. Welcome. Andrea is the Deputy Program Director West for Vote Solar. Vote Solar was founded in 2002 and is focused on advocating for clean technology, clean energy in the policy and regulatory arenas at the state level, which I think is kind of where it all happens. So welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. It's good to be with you today.
Mel Bergmeiter. Mel, raise your hand. Mel is the first employee and currently handles all of their executive accounts for Illum Energy. And Illum Energy is focused really on delivering affordable solar in a multi-metered environment, i.e., multifamily residences. Okay. Third up is Daniel Komalafi. Daniel is on the other side of the world. He is the chairman of First Electric, which is, I believe, one of the fastest growing solar energy as a service companies in Nigeria. And so he's going to be able to bring a totally different perspective. And fourth and finally, who will be popping up on the screen at any moment, is Arash Sadie. And Arash works for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the largest municipally owned utility in the country. And as we all know, it's kind of at the utility sector, the energy sector that we got to really focus on in the near term. So those are the panelists. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. So let's start with a discussion of what is solar justice, what is injustice, what does it kind of look like? Maybe what are the causes? And Andrea, I'm going to start with you first. But before you talk about that, give a little bit more about what Vote Solar is all about, and then we can talk about that. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, again, it's great to be with you all in this great panel. And just a clarification, Vote Solar is a national organization, but I do work in the West and specifically in California. So we do advocate for an equitable way of ensuring that we have access to solar energy and overall clean energy and also electrification. So just having access to it all. We understand that so far, most of the clean technologies and clean energy has been accessible to mostly the wealthy, and we need to change that. So that's why Vote Solar has been now advocating alongside environmental justice groups and others to make sure that we, moving forward, that is changed. And we make sure that no one is left behind.
So what is your definition of solar justice?
So if I may, I do want to show some of the slides that I have in terms of just you showing what
What it looks like.
yes, because I think there's especially here in Southern California where I am right now, we are the biggest urban oil field in the nation, and this is really tangible. So I don't know if you can all see my screen.
We can now.
And you can see how many oil fields we have. And we have oil fields next to schools, next to houses, next to where people live, work, play, and worship. And they're all over the place, but especially where low-income people of color live. And next, we have the Kalimvar screen. So you could see exactly how people are affected, especially those where, again, socioeconomic status are different, and that is affecting health, that is affecting a whole array of things.
And Andrea, this screen is focused on the Los Angeles basin. Is that what we're looking at?
Yes, this is the LA County.
Okay.
So
Okay,
we're
good.
looking at Southern California right now.
Okay.
And then we can see where the solar installations have been happening so far. So if you look again at the coastal area where most of the green is, that's where most of the clean air is, and where the solar installations have been happening. Again, you see this is environmental racism in a picture, and we need to change that. We need to make sure that we deploy clean energy everywhere, not just where the wealthy live. So this is, I think, a really tangible way of seeing what's been happening. So we need to really stop drilling where we're living. We need to make sure that we deploy the clean energy that we all deserve, and that we have energy democracy.
You know, I was totally surprised by the fact that LA has the largest oil fields. I would not have guessed that. You know.
Yes.
So, to what degree? Okay, I'm an entrepreneur. Okay, and so my perspective is a little bit slanted in that respect. In my experience, when new technologies come out, okay, as they move up that adoption curve, they start out as expensive, and then they get less expensive as they economies of scale. We've seen that in electric cars, right? They started out to be incredibly expensive, over $100,000, and now they're still maybe a touch more expensive than regular, but they're coming down. So what part of that map that you showed, okay, with the solar folks on the coast is due to that, and the fact that technologies in the beginning are expensive?
Well, I think that the way that we deployed the actual incentives was not optimal, and it could have been done a lot better. And I think that is starting to change, which is really good, especially with the IRA and other state incentives that are more focused on their income based. So we really need to make sure that moving forward, we really look at how equitable those incentives and rebates are. And we are, I think we're changing that radically, and that's what needs to happen.
That's good. That's a good point. So another thing in preparing for this and reading a bunch of research, okay, I came across a finding that not only is solar underrepresented in low or moderate income households. I think low and moderate income households are about 43% of all households in the U.S., and solar penetration is about 15%. So you know there's a major discrepancy there in terms of but we've also seen that there is a lower degree of market interest in solar among the lower moderate income households. Can you speak a little bit as to why? It just doesn't seem to be, because I think that's part of the issue here.
Yeah, well, again, first, these rebates, there were rebates in the sense of, okay, you have to first pony up the money and then you have to wait for the rebate. Many people can't afford to do that. Then there were a lot of speculators within the solar industry who ripped people off, and that right now is affecting also that part. So people are very skeptical about putting solar on their roof, and we need to go back and say, no, there's legitimate companies who will put solar on your roof for an affordable price or even for free with a rebate. So I think that's part of it. And even outside the DWP territory, Edison territory, right now, what we're facing is the new net energy metering problem that solar installations are down over 80%, and we have lost 17,000 jobs because of the ruling that the Public Utility Commission handed out last year. I'm not saying
essentially a reduction in the rate of compensation for people who install solars. I'm totally simplifying this. Okay?
Yeah,
but
no.
I think that's it.
And we really need policies that are going to be incentivizing solar, not punishing people who install solar. And that's what we have been seeing right now. So this is not the time to be cutting back on solar. We have a climate crisis. We have people getting poisoned where they live. And we also need it for resiliency beyond climate. We are living in a seismic land, and we're going to have an earthquake soon. We don't know when. So we need to ensure that people don't have explosive fuels and just have clean energy where they're living.
I think also in part of this, once again, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a business guy. This lack of market interest is also, I think, kind of dependent upon the fact that it's a pretty complicated thing to figure out. Installing solar, I mean, it just is, okay, and what's the right solution? And two, the information that's provided and the meetings and so forth are not always convenient to somebody who's working, a 9-to-5 job. They're held during the day, not at the evening. Therefore, people aren't able to, the under-resourced folks aren't able to get the information because they're in fact trying to make a living. So I think that's also contributed to this. Well, what does solar mean to me? I can't afford it. I don't understand it. I'm not going to be able to get it. So move on to the next thing. And I think that's a challenge that we all have.
Yeah, and I actually attended a meeting a couple of years ago where they were basically trying to inform the community in Wilmington. And unfortunately, they did not have language access. And even though it was not my meeting, I actually end up taking it over and explaining people in Spanish what solar was, what EV were, and like all these type of technology and how it was going to be accessible. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make the information accessible, and that's part of making it also equitable, because you need to make sure that you reach those who are suffering, and we cannot leave anyone behind.
Right. And I think I'll jump on that one too. I mean, LMI is really our bread and butter. And I think
LMI is low, moderate income, right?
Right. Okay. When it comes to access. And so just a quick background on Loom. So we work in multifamily housing. So we believe that renters in particular who live in apartments should have access to solar. And so we have a private infrastructure solution, which is called the SoShare, that enables one single solar rooftop to be shared amongst the neighbors, basically, within that same building. And so to your question around the interest and the low moderate income access, another thing that I wanted to bring up is really that renter market. Here in LA, over half of the population rents. Myself, I'm a renter. And so most of the solar solutions that really cater towards single family owners. When you look at a solar project, typically they look at 20-year returns, or they look at, okay, how is that going to impact your roof? There's a lot of these things that are tied to you must own that place. And so when we look at the renter market, in here, over half of the population, then we're starting to look at, okay, what do we do in the situation where we need flexibility? People are constantly moving. They don't own the place. How do we go about that? So that's really the part that we address. So I just wanted to point that out. That is beyond interest. There's also the access to
let's go
how
down
they
that
work.
path for a minute,
Mhm.
okay? All right.
Yeah.
So if you're in an apartment building, you have your own meter. You pay
Right.
your electricity bill based on the amount of your apartment uses. So how does solar, which is a source of electricity, how does that impact? Why is that impacting? Why is that slowing down?
Right. So in most cases, let's say somebody has their individual meters. Let's
Mhm.
say if apartment buildings want to install solar, for the default, they would only do it to the common area. So what you would think, the common light and power, security systems, everything that's shared within that building. But you could have solar on your apartment building and not get the benefits of solar, because there's the whole issue between how do you get it to your meter individually. So that's what we address, basically
Is it,
one
and
to
this
many.
is so I understand, okay, is it,
Right.
how do we get it to your meter, or is it, how do we apportion the cost of solar to temporary residents, if you will,
Right. So that's the
versus the landlord or
yeah,
asset owner?
that's the classic split incentive that we see a lot in the solar energy efficiency industry. And that's all about who pays the cost of what and who sees the benefit. So we have multiple mechanisms to address that, mainly around amenities. But yeah, that's a key point about
Okay,
it.
so we're going to come back and talk about how Illum and others address this issue.
Mhm.
I want to now introduce the laggard to the discussion, Arash Zaidi. Arash, welcome.
Thank you.
um, Arash, let me see here. Your title is Power Engineering Manager of Distributed Resources Development and Programs for the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So first of all, what does that title mean? What do you do?
Okay, great. And again, my sincerest apologies for joining late. I could not find this link for the life of me, and wasn't on the calendar, so I was scrambling. But in any case, to answer your question, so I oversee the development of a portfolio of solar programs that reach our customers depending on their various financial, socioeconomic conditions and environmental challenges they face. In addition to that, demand response programs, and that includes our Power Savers program, which is essentially where we control thermostats at people's homes and small commercial businesses, and as well large commercial customers. And then the third thing we do is we develop not only new programs that address our customers' needs, but in addition to that, we secure funding from outside sources like the Department of Energy, and most recently our SCHIP funding that we were able to wrestle from a fellow utility in the nearby area, which secured us $82 million of energy storage incentives. And then lastly, we developed solar projects, solar storage and EV projects. So basically resiliency projects on city facilities. And so that's kind of a myriad of different activities my team oversees. So really excited to be here and have a robust discussion about equity as it relates to adoption of these technologies.
So let's start, Arash, with, from your perspective, what is the definition of solar justice, and what does solar injustice look like in the DWP world? You know, whether it's past, present. Let's talk about the problem.
Yeah, I think we need to go to the history of it before we get into what the future looks like. And part of the reason why we have injustices in this area has a lot to do with, historical inequities that were created, such as redlining, higher densities of communities, and then of course housing covenants that have prevented certain types of demographics from acquiring property, real property. In addition to that, a lot of these communities that happen to be considered underserved, I like to use that term, versus disadvantaged, but these underserved communities happen to be exposed to higher environmental hazards, whether it's emissions from trucks rolling through their homes or power plants, or type of businesses that emit other type of either high heat or industrial waste. And then, of course, least access to transit, right? That's another aspect of this that's very important, because the largest polluting sector that's been determined as part of our multiple studies that we've done is the transportation sector. So our objective at DWP is to decarbonize that transportation sector. And we realize electricity is going to be the bulk of it, but there are other solutions on the table. And so we're welcoming all of those as part of this effort. And so that being said, the future, if I were to kind of surmise that, is to develop programs, projects, and of course, secure funding so that these communities are the first beneficiaries of these investments. So if we're upgrading, or rather, I should say, maybe taking an overhead wire and putting it underground, those communities should be the first beneficiaries of this, because obviously there's an eyesore component to it, but beyond that, there's also a reliability component. If a car runs into a pole, that goes down and many customers, thousands, can be affected. We saw that the last 2 weeks where the heavy rain led to erosion and caused a lot of our power poles, well, not a lot, but rather a few of our power poles in critical areas caused havoc to our ratepayers. So that's one aspect of it. Yes.
Andrea had a wonderful slide on the location of solar installations house, and it's all along the coast in the higher income areas. And part of this discussion was that part of the reason of that is that's where incentives were focused on higher income households. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think, okay, so if we take solar specifically and incentives, right? Senate Bill 1 that was signed by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2006 required utilities in California to adopt a solar incentive program. CSI, or California Solar Initiative, is what the IOUs adopted, investor-owned utilities. And then we developed our own program that mirrored that concept. So we allocated $313 million. And the bulk of those funds were used or leveraged by affluent communities by an overwhelming number. And obviously, this isn't the ideal situation, but we had to dole out the funds, and whoever applied did so. And usually the way it works is the first adopters to any sort of new technology happens to be affluent communities, such as EVs. We saw this very well when the first adopters of EVs were wealthy, affluent folks who acquired Tesla Roadsters, and then it eventually led to the Model S and so forth. The same concept applies here with solar. So the affluent communities took advantage of it, partly due to the financing that they could acquire, as well as the ability to just pay for it outright because they have the means. And of course, there was probably a lower education process with it, right? A lot of these deals had to be sold in person. It's not like you could just go online 10 years ago and say, I want to do solar. That's available today. 10 years ago, you need to knock on doors and convince somebody they needed to do solar. And once they looked at the economics and said the payback period was between 3 to 7 years, it was a no-brainer. So that's one aspect of it. And a lot of these folks own their home. So if you're a renter, you couldn't just install solar. You would have to ask your landlord. The landlord would have to think about it and weigh the costs and options, and probably would end up with a no. And the same thing goes with multifamily, right? They don't own the rooftop. And so what we've done here at DWP is created programs that doesn't require you to own the rooftop, but yet you can still be part of the movement.
So one of the things that LADWP has done, which is universally acknowledged as a forward-leaning initiative, was something called the LA 100 study. And for those of you who are not familiar with the LA 100 study, it essentially lays out, I think, 5 different paths for LADWP to get from here to carbon neutrality by 2045. Not only is technology as well as financial and so forth. Recently, I think you added on to, and by the way, that study, which I applaud LADWP for doing, it's being looked at by utilities as far away as India as a framework, as a model to figure. This is a pretty difficult thing to figure out, how to shift a utility from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels and still maintain costs and so forth. So you also added onto that, I think it's called the LA 100 equity study. And what I would like you to articulate a little bit is, what are the problems that study found in the equity side of LADWP? We're going to talk about the solutions, obviously, in a minute, but talk to me a little bit about what the findings of that study were about the problem.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. So the LA 100 equity strategy was teamed up with NREL and UCLA to basically look at all the different injustices, so the history behind the why this happened, and then of course looking at what specific issues they found, and then recommendations that came from that. And that was just recently announced, I think, in November. So over the next year or so, we are going to come back to our community-based organizations, our ratepayers, to say, we heard you, thank you for the recommendations, and here are the changes we plan to implement over the course of the next few months. Some may be quick fixes. We can go to our board and or council, get those changes done. Some require ballot measure changes, propositions that need to be thought about again because the new landscape has changed. And so that's going to really be the objective going forward. So I kind of alluded to a couple of them in terms of redlining, housing covenants, but when we go further into that, we found that there was a lot of electrical distribution grid upgrades that needed to occur as a result, street improvements, and not just looking at the utility itself, but also just city services, stormwater capture. All these things were found to be, challenges in these communities. Beyond that, we also looked at more of our programs, and so what we looked at is that, for instance, our solar incentive program, 38% was only spent on underserved communities, which left areas like South LA, Harbor to really not receive many of those incentives, which is a shame because they have great exposure to sunlight, given that there's not a lot of tree coverage and what have you. So it would have been an ideal scenario. Now, if we look a step further, our EV chargers and charging rebates was another issue that we found, where about of the 5 million that was invested over the course of 7 years between 13 and 2021, 23% was only spent in underserved communities. So areas like South LA, San Fernando Valley didn't receive a lot of those infrastructure incentives. And that's a shame because they want to adopt EVs, but if there's no infrastructure either at their homes, businesses, or publicly available, well, that becomes a severe challenge for adoption. And that's one of the things that we have to get more creative in how we do that. And so to specifically talk about this, we're now developing e-hubs, or rather electric vehicle hubs, where folks can come in, pull up, charge their vehicles through a DC fast charger system, and then be able to attribute that to their electric rate at DWP. So if they live somewhere else in Los Angeles, they'll be able to get the preferred rate. And so that's being developed right now. We have 2 contemplated, one in the Northeast Valley and one in South Los Angeles, with many more to come over the next few years.
So I'm assuming because I was talking to Iran the other day, there's 100 of these planned. I assume that of those 100, a large percentage of those are going to be in low, moderate income areas.
You're absolutely correct. Yeah, and that's really the objective. Is before we may have just said, let's put it where it has the highest impact on the existing transportation, but what we're looking at is how can we impact transportation in those communities so that people can adopt these technologies and stray away from fossil emitting and high emitting vehicles.
Okay, we're going to come back to all of this in a second. I want to shift gears and go to Africa. Daniel, welcome. And I know that that solar justice means something different in Nigeria than it means here. But before we get into that, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your company, and then what is the situation in Nigeria about solar and rural electrification and so forth. Give us paint a picture for us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Fred. Thanks for the privilege to be here. So at First Electric, what we do is we make solar energy available in underserved and unserved communities in a way that's accessible and affordable. And we do that using something called energy as a service, where customers pay per kilowatt hour for what they consume without having to purchase the solar equipment. And talking about solar justice, let me pull up a very quick picture. I'll share that right now. Can you see that?
Yes,
Right
yes, great. Yeah. So what are we looking at?
So this is one of the communities that we electrified, but let me speak generally from my perspective, as someone living in Nigeria, where 46% of the population, approximately 90 million people, lack access to reliable electricity. This is a fact, okay? And also in the context of the average Nigerian having a per capita income of less than $2,000, which means the purchasing power is generally low. So it's a challenge for people to purchase solar equipment that costs $6,000 or $5,000. It's just very, very unaffordable for the vast majority of the population. So solar justice refers to the situation where citizens have equitable access to solar power, regardless of their geographical location. Either they live in Lagos, that's a city, or Abuja, or they live in a village like this, right? Or their economic status or social status, right? That's what solar justice means to us, right? And this basically means ensuring that solar energy policies and programs are not disproportionately favor the wealthy or people living in the urban spaces, okay? But rather are designed in such a way that everyone, including low-income households or communities in remote areas, can benefit from clean and reliable renewable energy. And that's the foundation that what drives the work we do in Nigeria. So this community
just to state something that's obvious, I guess, to everybody, those 90 million people who don't have access to electricity, they're in the rural parts of Nigeria mainly. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. So about 50% of those live in the rural communities, but then about 50% of those actually live in the urban communities, right?
Okay.
Like even in Abuja, where I'm currently staying, which is the federal capital, just before we came up on this call, I had a power cut for basically 8 hours from 7 a.m. when I woke up till about just about a few minutes ago. The power was off, right? And so what I have in my house is actually solar. I have solar solution in my house that provides me with solar plus battery solution that gives me backup when the sun is not shining, right? So this is basically what we do.
Okay, continue. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. So basically, so it's very important to make sure that those in low income areas, those in the remote places, where it may not be initially commercially interesting for developers to go in there, is to make sure those people are not left out of the conversation. And it's, for us, we find that very compelling because not only can it be actually profitable, it creates massive economic impact, social impact when you target those communities that are underserved. And that's what we do.
Well, we know that here in the U.S. that one of the primary hurdles to solar for low and moderate income families is the upfront costs, right? And that's got to be a major hurdle in Nigeria as well. My question is it's kind of twofold. Is that true? Okay. And I saw in the picture that you showed of a family, you had a single solar panel on the roof. Is that adequate for families in Nigeria? Is that good enough?
Okay, so Nigeria is a very special country, right? You get very affluent people living in Lagos and the cities in Abuja, and then you have people like very low income families also living in rural communities. Yes, generally speaking, it is true that solar solutions is expensive for the vast majority of the population. That's very, very true. And when we started off, we actually did try to sell, but we realized we weren't selling enough solar solutions because most people could not afford to buy them. And what we did was we partnered with certain banks and financial institutions who were able to offer credit to people that would qualify, but those were still more middle class and upper class people. But then the population was slightly wider. And then we decided that, hey, we're not really solving the major problem here. And that's why we decided to pivot to the model of energy as a service, because with that, all you do is pay a connection fee, and then you get charged.
It's essentially a prepaid energy card. Is that how I would think of it? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it is true. A lot of people in Nigeria still cannot afford to transition to solar energy.
Interesting. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the solutions. What needs to get done to reduce these inequities? And Andre, I'm going to let you start off first again. And I guess, I want to know is, I was going to say as simply as possible, but maybe not, of what policies and kinds of regulations directly do we need to address solar injustice now at the state level?
Well, first of all, how those incentives are applied. And I think they really need to be, especially for low wealth folks in households, those incentives need to be applied first. And I think we're getting there. There's some incentives that right now they're there in basically you do get that, for instance, for heat pumps or for other clean technology, you can get that fund upfront, but there's still some part of it that has to be applied to your taxes when you file. So that gets complicated, and it's not optimal. I know there's growing pains. I think it's also worth mentioning how efficiency plays a role in all of this. Back when we were doing the LA 100 study, we also had a energy atlas that UCLA and NRDC worked on that showed that 4% of buildings were using 50% of the electricity in LA. Wow. So that's an absurd amount of waste. And I think if we were to cut that by half, we're talking about 1/4 of all the load in Los Angeles. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that. And I really think that the cheapest kilowatt is the one that we don't have to produce. And make sure that we rebuild a just economy and renewables with the energy that we actually need, not building back all this waste. And again, I think it's really important also to see where this waste is happening, because it's likely to be happening in older buildings where it's likely that a lot of underserved communities are living. So let's just do that. Now, I do commend DWP on having a really good program where they come to your home and they do a lot of like an energy audit and they see if there's any kind of leaks or drafts, and if you have energy efficiency appliance, including water appliances. So I did have that done. Unfortunately, because it's so popular, it takes months for someone to come to your house. So I think we really need to be looking at where the money that we have makes the most sense, and not only it's the most sense economically, but also in an equitable way. So there's that. And also how the rebates are applied. And one of the things that happened to me when I did my heat pump, it took 13 months to get my rebate back. And I think that's an issue. A lot of people can't afford to do that. And it took 13 months after me calling DWP every 2 weeks and calling my council office and getting them involved. A lot of people don't have that ability to be doing all that. So I think there's that. And also the fact that we need to look at rate design. If we peak, and that's likely to happen with a lot of folks who have 2 or 3 jobs, you come home, you use all the appliances at once because that's how you have to do it. So you might be using your induction stove, you might be using your electric dryer, you might be using all these appliances. Once you go into the 3rd tier, you do have this fee, $15, I think it's a month, and they will penalize you for an entire year. So how can we make it so that when we go all electric, we don't penalize people for going all electric. So I think there's a lot of discussions to be had and make sure that we grow in a more equitable way and in a way that we make our city better and again more equitable.
So what I heard was there's an opportunity for incentives and rebates to be different strategies and focus in different areas. The whole built environment is a big opportunity in terms of energy efficiency, and the third is looking at rate structures and seeing if we can make them less punishable to the low and moderate income folks, part of which is response time and so forth. Right?
Yeah, and I think for others, we also need some kind of, I mean, we have the technology to have an app and saying you're about to peak, turn your, dishwasher off or, whatever. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here to make sure that we save energy, we save resources, and we live in a more resilient way, with microgrids and with energy democracy too. And I really do think that having less of these power plants that are poisoning us is one key to doing that.
It's a good thing, yeah. Okay. Raj, I'm going to give you a chance to respond and talk a little bit more, but I want to first of all go to Mel. All right, so tell me, in the multi-metered environment, what needs to happen to make it better?
Yeah, so the biggest thing and biggest obstacle we've seen is around the implementation side of things. So we see the incentives. We might be familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, with all the tax credits that are coming down the pipeline. And then we also see the mandates, like different cities where you'll have 100% renewable by an X date. So there's that push to get things done. But the issue that we have found, and especially from the private sector, it's all around the almost like that permission to operate, to that actual being allowed in certain territories. So what we have found is typically with electric utilities, they can fall into two categories. So the first one is a response that's a little bit of a fear-based response, where this is a new technology. We're used to a grid. The grid has been, this paradigm of the grid has been lasted for 100 years or more, where it's a very direct type of grid. So you have your operators, you have your distribution systems, and you sell to customers, and that's one directional grid. But now we're seeing a grid that is changing. So now we see people who are selling back into the grid, or we're seeing even EV vehicles that can discharge into the grid. And so we're seeing all these different technologies, but we still have, certain regulatory entities that are a little bit of trying to protect kind of the older model and what they're used to. And so that makes it a little bit difficult when it comes to actual implementation, because this is all about embracing change. And then the second category that we see is typically utilities that are proactive, who understand that the grid is changing and think about it as an opportunity to actually be ahead of the curve. So when it comes to, okay, let's implement this, let's figure out a way, let's say with demand response, let's figure out a way with EV chargers, let's actually bring this into the mix more and more and work closer with those in the private sector. So I think that's really the obstacle that we're seeing, just kind of that mindset shift with a lot of utilities when it comes to understanding this is not just one piece of the puzzle, but actually look at the bigger picture of a grid that is changing.
Okay, Arash.
Well, I gotta say, Mel nailed it straight on the head, and Andrea, you again also brought an idea that I was actually going to bring up. So thank you for making my life easier. So now there's going to be another person that's going to reiterate exactly what was said. So like Mel was addressing, we've been so used to this unidirectional delivery of power that now the future is optimization of energy consumption and energy generation. We're not used to that, right? And so it's been a bit of a struggle as operators of a utility to adapt to that. However, we've kind of forced that agenda from our planning level down to the operations level. So they're now becoming more and more acclimated to the notion, to the point where now the future is a big board in a operating room where they'll have nodes that tell them exactly how much is available on every single circuit or transmission line or what have you, and they can push buttons to essentially dispatch those resources in the most optimal manner. Because there is a challenge with operating grid, because not only are you balancing power, you're also balancing frequency and all these other parameters, and that's extremely challenging, especially when you have injection of power at non-opportune times. So that kind of weaves into the rate structure, right? That needs to be changed altogether. Our rates are stuck in 2008. They haven't really changed. Our time of use rates do not reflect the actual time in which peak periods occur. So that's a whole modernization process that needs to be addressed in the coming months and years through our rates team who is working on that adamantly. So to basically kind of oversee all these activities, I think from the ground up, we need to get the word in the hands of our ratepayers, right? And we as a utility haven't done a great job. So there's no point in saying,
you guys are not good marketers.
We're not. And there are folks that do that very well. And what we have to understand is those specific underserved communities that we're trying to reach do not sit at home from 9 to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. They're out there hustling every single day. So we need to reach them where they're at. So if that means from 5 p.m. till 9 p.m. we're knocking on doors, or if we're meeting them on the weekends, that's where it makes sense. And so that's something that CBOs can absolutely help us to get the message across in terms of the portfolio of options available. The hand-holding process that they may need is going to be a part of that. The other thing we have to look at is when we're contracting out work, because we can't do it all, that public-private partnership model, that requires inherent knowledge of how Los Angeles works, meaning not only do we want you to hire from local folks on the ground, boots on the ground from LA, but on top of that, we want you to focus on targeting our customers, those specific customers in those underserved communities, in a manner that wasn't done before in the past. So there will be, in contracts that I pursue, a component in our evaluation where we say X% of this weighted score shall be from, should develop a plan that serves our customers in these underserved communities. So that's another part of it. It's not just saying we offer programs, but we also bring in staff and resources that are reflective of Los Angeles's makeup. And then, of course, there's another part is the incentives, right? It's one thing to offer an incentive and say, if you apply here, you'll get it. But as Andrea mentioned just moments ago, that she had to go hustle and find that incentive and knock on doors and call her council. It should not be that hard. Okay, so the other thing we need to do is do our best to front load as much of this incentive as possible. So it gets in the hands of either the developer who's putting the resource on their homes or what have you, or in the hands of the customer who's adopting this new technology. So I think that's another aspect that we're going to be looking at to ease that financial burden, because otherwise it's just going to be cost prohibitive. If you have to tell someone and you have to install a $20,000 plus solar system and you have to say, you have to wait 9 months, but you have to fork over the money now, it's dead in the water. It's just not going to happen. So that's another thing that I think is going to be very important as we look forward.
I have a question for you, and I know it's so you've heard on a couple fronts that time is really an issue, either time in incentives, time in getting permission. Is your management, is your executive management team aware of the importance of time and reducing it in a whole range of fronts? And I know it's not an easy thing. I don't mean this because it's a big organization. It's bureaucratic in both a good and bad way. I mean, you guys deliver electricity all the time, 100%. It's inexpensive. All that is because there's a bureaucracy and a method, but it's also slow in the other way. Does your management understand the importance of speeding that up?
Yeah, that's a extremely great question. I think one thing that we have to rely on is our management is relatively new. The head of power system has been in his position for about 9 months or so. And then Aram, who you mentioned earlier, Benjamin, is our chief operations officer. And he has hit the ground running. From the moment he's come in, he's structurally changed the organization to be more adaptable and effective in deploying not only resources, but also programs and making sure that we have the contractual aspects of getting work done. Because again, with 11,000 employees, you would think you can just get things done like this, but it's not always possible. And so you do need to rely on outside resources. And so we've done a great job in working with our labor partners, whether it's Local 11, Local 18, and other trades folks to bring in that qualified labor and make sure they not only work an honest day's work, but also get an honest day's pay, because we don't want people having multiple jobs to do this work. We want them to be able to rely on this good paying job with good benefits to be able to deliver these resources to us. And that's another aspect of how we deliver our services. So I think to answer your question very bluntly, we're in the best position I think we've been with the management team we have now to actually adapt and to follow through with these recommendations.
Excellent. Daniel, what needs to happen to reduce some of this solar injustice in Nigeria?
So Mel touched on something pretty important that about the centralized grid and how that is changing. I think in Nigeria specifically, we have a great opportunity to leapfrog and to just go from having zero electricity in many communities to having solar-derived electricity. And that's something that is a great opportunity. But for that to happen, a few things need to be in place, okay? Financing or access to finance is one of the biggest challenges for any of this happening, right? Money flows when returns can flow back, right? And one of the REA, the Rural Electrification Agency, has done a fantastic work so far in providing access to subsidies to solar developers. But I think they can do definitely much more. There's more room for improvement in doing that. That will incentivize people going into these rural communities or these underserved areas and making sure we deploy solar in those communities. I think that's one thing that can be done. Also, capacity building and making sure people really understand what solar is and how it works and the benefit, and that solar can actually be a financially sensible solution for you, right? Because the price of diesel and gasoline right now is really through the roof, right? And solar can be a viable alternative, and that's what people need to definitely get educated about that. So that can really help itself. And I think leveraging on the right type of finance, because solar is not a short-term investment, okay? And most of the commercial banks don't have the appetite to fund solar projects. So I think being able to leverage the pension funds and those that can take a long view, and to do that, sometimes the government needs to come in with a kind of a guarantee to say, well, what would guarantee this developer if you're able to give them access to this pension fund? And I think those are kind of the conversations that we have currently ongoing. But if everything comes together, I think we definitely have a great opportunity to revolutionize the renewable energy sector in Nigeria. And it's something I'm definitely bullish on, and I'm looking forward to the success that could definitely be realized in this sector.
So I want to go back to a subject. I know it's incredibly complicated, controversial, but I want to kind of understand, Rush, why do utilities are challenged by rooftop solar or distributed solar? What is the challenge in that? Why do they have trouble with that? And I'm assuming they do, but I think, and I know we could spend 2 days talking about this, but
yeah, I will give you my perspective, but there's many vantage points, right? So the first thing is we need solar. There's no question about it as a utility. We need it to be cheap. We need it to be reliable, and we need it to be something that obviously we can have some visibility into when it's being generated. The difference between the different types of solars out there is one, there's behind the meter. that offsets a customer's energy consumption, and then there's one that just injects back into the grid, or rather front of the meter type of solar. So most homes in LA, and for the lack of better explanation, it's across the nation, is behind the meter. So customers have effectively said, I will pay for this solar system to be installed, or I will lease this system, and for that I will reduce my energy consumption, thus I pay the utility less. The challenge we, a utility, have is that when we've made investments, so new distribution stations, new power lines, new all things, those are done over 20-year bonds that we have issued to effectively invest in this infrastructure. Because even if you have solar, you still need to make sure power flows, because power does not generate at night through solar, right? So let's just be clear about that. Once the sun goes down, there is no solar generation. If you're fortunate enough to have had a battery and you built enough, solar, you could store that, use it later on the day, but ultimately that's a challenge, right? So from a utility perspective, we're looking at it as, if they're not paying the energy charges associated that we were used to accumulating, then all that infrastructure upgrade, who are we making it for? So what happens is it actually falls on the backs of those that cannot adopt solar. And guess who that is? Those underserved communities. So they are the ones who bear the blunt challenges, the affordability challenges with our infrastructure upgrades, because they can't put solar and say, I want to just remove myself from the utility or eliminate my energy consumption. And so the affluent communities stand to gain from this, right? They'll just pay their minimum charges if they build enough solar system on their homes and businesses, and say, okay, that's somebody else to deal with, not my problem. That can't happen, right? And so part of the way, let's say, the IOUs have challenged it is said, why don't we change the net billing tariff, right? So going from what they call net energy metering 1.0, which was like a one-for-one retail kind of approach, credit or compensation, to what it is now, NEM 3.0, which is far below that and doesn't always make solar pencil out from the get-go. So I think that is the main challenge we see. And so when we're still on NEM 1.0. We haven't even evolved that, and part of that is because of the rate structure that's still circa 2008. But eventually, that is something that's on the table for discussion: is how do we evolve that net billing tariff or solar tariff in a manner that allows equitable distribution of the investments that we have to make as a utility to serve our customers the electricity they need 24/7 and as reliably as possible. So I'll stop there.
Anybody want to comment?
I have a follow-up question on that. I'm curious. I mean, coming from the solar industry, this is great. I'm really curious about, when you take a look at any bill, you have your distribution charges, you have your fuel charges that are associated with how much power you actually used. But then there's also all these fixed charges that no matter if you have solar or don't have solar, you're still paying for them. So I'm curious, and especially when it comes to LADWP, when you're thinking about, the burden of the solar costs going to the rest of the population, are you factoring in all of those fixed costs and no matter what, everybody has to pay?
Yeah, so again, our rate structure, because of the just challenges that we've had to update them, are again stuck in 2008. So at that time, we said the minimum charge for a residential customer that's not time of use would be $10 per month.
Right.
That obviously we've had inflation, we've had COVID, we've had all these different factors. That $10 is old. It just does not actually cover our fixed charges, to be very blunt with you. So we're hoping to recoup those through either energy charges or through the cost adjustment charges that we charge. But that's based on a kilowatt hour. Right. If you have 0 kilowatt hour consumption, we're not recouping anything. And what's happening is now you're having this disparity for those that do have solar and those that don't have solar. And it's creating this inequity that we've seen. And we're going to be under collecting billions of dollars on an annual basis after 2030. And that means we can't pay our debts, the debts that we incurred to invest in the infrastructure, to take overhead wires, put them underground, to build transmission lines to access large scale solar, geothermal, other types of renewable resources. And that's, again, not a problem that we today can fix, but it's something that our rates managers and folks at the highest levels like Aram and Simon will come to that, so to say, conclusion of how do we do that in a manner that, again, is equitable, so that not underserved communities, so that underserved communities aren't taking the blunt of this affordability challenge. The other just little piece to this I want to add is we're now asking folks to transition away from a internal combustion engine vehicle to an electric vehicle, which means inherently they got to charge it somewhere, and likely they'll charge it at home. Either level 1, they'll plug it in a normal socket, or they'll get a level 2 charger. Their bills will go up. But we have to explain to them that if their bills are going up, you're offsetting the fuel costs at the pump. There's you're trading off something. So they're going to still feel the blunt of, I got to pay DWP so much more. But at the other side of it, we have to educate them that you're not paying the oil companies and the refineries their sort of say fees to operate your vehicle. So there is a win-win. Well, there's a challenge in the education process we have to undergo.
Right. And I think just to add on to that, there's also electrification, changing from your gas powered oven to electric oven. So I think there's two sides of the equation here. Going down a power on an LADWP perspective, you're seeing less power being used because more people are adopting renewables, but at the same time, you're seeing more power being used on other sides because of EVs and electrification. So I'm wondering if you guys are looking at it as a balancing of the revenue, or if it's something that you would just have in different conversations.
So I will say this, if you look at load growth, that's, I think, essentially what you're saying.
Right.
Historically, we've actually seen a decline in load. Part of the reason is folks are adopting solar at a very high clip, about 75 to 100 megawatts per year in our territory. So whatever energy that they're using or electrifying, it's being offset by solar when you look at the whole entire load. But we're hoping that if we can transition a very large percentage of our transportation sector, not only the residential sector, but also medium duty, heavy duty fleet operators, last mile deliveries, bus transportation, that's, I think, where we can recoup some of these costs and ease that burden for the ratepayers. And the hope is if we install more of that infrastructure, make it accessible to our customers, that effectively spreads the overall costs and stabilizes it for the entire group. But you're spot on. I mean, electrification is happening. I'm going through renovation myself, and so everything is being electrified in my home because I can, and I eventually will invest in solar, and then eventually not have to pay the utility. But that is, again, a process we're all going to have to go through as we look forward.
Yeah.
I would like to add, in terms of EVs, it's not just the cost in terms of charging your vehicle, but other costs associated with them in terms of maintenance that also will go down. And also, the more we invest in electric vehicles in underserved communities, that means that there's fewer internal combustion engines driving around, and therefore less pollution. So I think that's something that we need to be mindful of, because the sooner we implement those chargers and policies, the sooner that these communities are going to be healthier. And I think that's key. And the same thing with the electrification. I mean, when I used to have a gas stove, and every winter I would get so sick, and I didn't really knew it was so bad. And once I got my induction stove, I stopped having this like horrendous cough every winter, when I usually would cook more hot meals, and it just makes such a difference. And no one deserves to be poisoned where they live. So I really think that we need to implement that, especially in older buildings, especially for renters who don't really have a say over what kind of appliances they have.
Yeah. Agree.
Okay. I want to switch gears a little bit as we slowly run out of time here. I want to do a round of, is there something you want to talk about that I haven't asked? That's the first part of it. Okay, I'm sure there is. How could I not ask all the right questions? But secondly, part of that is, have you seen any new business models that are really interesting, that might be of interest? I don't quite understand, but I know there's something going on in Minnesota where consumers are buying subscriptions into what I would call a utility scale solar. How does that work? Does that have potential? Anyways, that's the question. Is there something you want to say that we haven't talked about? And are there any new business models that are of interest? And Daniel, you're going to be the first guy up on this.
Sure, absolutely. So I've seen some innovative solutions, because in the solar space, the cost of the battery is probably one of the most significant costs, and especially in Nigeria here, where the grid is not available most of the time. So if you have solar, you should have battery, otherwise you can't really enjoy 24 hours electricity. So a friend of mine is doing something called the battery as a service, where you don't necessarily need to have solar, because the grid comes on maybe 6-8 hours a day in some areas. So what they do is they just have an inverter and a battery, and then they pay per kilowatt hour based on what is being stored inside the battery. I feel that's a cheaper way, because you don't need to worry about buying solar, but you can reduce your cost a little bit by just subscribing to the battery as a service solution. And I find that interesting, because the average consumption per house, the house I showed you in the picture earlier, well, that's a rural household. They consume around 1 kilowatt hour a day, maybe 500 watt hour sometimes. But then where I live, and in some other houses in Lagos and Abuja, the cities, they consume between 10 kilowatt hours to 20 kilowatt hours a day. So within that range, I think there's a huge market for battery as a service type solution. Yeah, I'll stop here for now, and if anything else comes to mind, I'm happy to share.
Mel, you're next up.
Yeah, so something we haven't touched is energy burdens. So I'll just quickly explain it. Just for everybody, the energy burden is really the percentage of your income actually going into paying electric utilities. So for example, the Department of Energy did a study, and this is kind of highlighting that discrepancy between, higher income individuals with lower income individuals, that for low income households, it is 3 times higher an energy burden than it is for your average income households. So this is, about 3% for average of your income going into paying utilities versus your 8.6% within low income. So that is another portion, and I know it could be a whole different webinar when it comes to energy burden, how much of your actual, income or gross income is going to paying for a necessity like it is utilities. So that's definitely another portion in the need for cleaner, cheaper power, just to make sure that that's more equitable across the United States and the world. And another thing I wanted to mention when it comes to your question around the business models. So the business model that we've seen applied the most, particularly with our product, and I can tell you the example of some projects we've done in Orlando, Florida, in which we are looking at solar as an amenity for apartments. So think about, your apartment could have AC or in-unit laundry. Well, now you could have an opportunity to say, hey, I want this solar, I want this apartment with solar. So some of these asset owners have actually implemented that. And let's say they will have a fixed fee per month, like an amenity fee. And so you can say, I'll charge, let's say $20 a month for you to get access to solar, but you're unlocking, as an example, $45 in savings because of lower utility bills. So in this type of model, you'll see a win-win benefit. So you see the tenant seeing lower utility bills, saving money, as well as the asset owner actually recouping the investment of solar. So that's how we go about solving the split incentive and just make it in as easy and accessible for tenants to opt in into these type of programs. So that's,
Interesting.
yeah, that's the type of
interesting.
models
Yeah.
we're following.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And Andrea, you're up.
Yes, two things. The first one is as we go and start really investing and ensuring that low-income households have access to electrification and clean technology, we need to make sure that no one gets displaced. And that's one thing that we're really worried about, and something we call greenification. And we, again,
What is that? Say it again.
greenification.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, so that means that, you know, we cleaned up, you know, a building, we retrofitted it, and we need to make sure that landlords don't take advantage of that and displace people. So we're also working with tenant rights organizations when we look at electrification of existing multifamily housing. Because again, no one deserves to be poisoned where they live, and no one deserves to be displaced. And we don't need to be adding to the homeless problem that we have right now in the state. So again, we just need to make sure that we do everything in an equitable way, and that also means keeping people in their homes. The other issue that I've seen in while COVID was happening, one of the persons that I used to see all the time was, of course, my mail carrier. And I convinced her to go solar, and she did. And it took 3 years to do the interconnection, and that's unacceptable, I think. So, and I just kept telling her, just call your council office and do this and do that. And I think to do, you know, 3 years of that is just horrific. I mean, I was really mad when it took me 3 months to get interconnected. So I think that there's a lot to be done. And again, it's like we cannot be punishing people for doing the right thing.
Arash?
Okay. I've got two ideas. And again, I'm not necessarily an entrepreneurial guy, but these are things that just come to mind. So I think we do an okay job of getting out infrastructure, specifically when it comes to solar, electric vehicles. Could be better on energy storage, but in any case, this infrastructure, it's great, but we also need to maintain it. And I think that's another aspect of deployment is, are those things reliably usable resources? I think the last time I checked, we had double-digit downtime on our EV charger infrastructure. Is that a good thing? Obviously not. And so we need to have resources and local firms that can actually do a lot of these truck rolls as quickly as possible. Not only monitor these assets so that, you know, there's immediate response time, but there's also the regular maintenance that's necessary for that. So a robust maintenance strategy is necessary. So if a vendor is out there that's willing to do this, I think they need to knock on doors and then get some meetings with DWP to get that word out. The other thing I think is going to be a challenge for us, maybe not today, but in the very near future, is transmission lines, meaning our ability to build a transmission line can take up to 10 or 15 years. And that's assuming that you can actually get the NIMBY folks on board with your project. So let's assume you do get that. That's going to be quite challenging to get through the finish line, because you're usually dealing with the federal government, because there's usually BLM land that you have to traverse as part of this transmission line. So what I'm getting at is we need to have actual modular and reliable generation resources in the basin, because as great as our transmission system is, and we own about 25% of the network in California, that's still not going to be enough to meet the future demands that's being projected as part of our LA 100 study. So a concept could be linear generators. These are systems that are capable of producing generation, relatively modular in size, stackable, which is great, and it can be basically placed anywhere, especially as we transition our as everybody is transitioning their EV fleets. They need to have delivery of service as quickly as possible. They can't wait a year or two for a line extension to serve their facility. Sometimes these linear generators can be brought in as a temporary solution and then repurposed later on somewhere else. And I think that's an area that we should probably look into. And there's a huge tax incentive under the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's another aspect that we have to look at as well.
Well,
Arash, I have a
right.
question for you because I've seen those chargers and there's a few around me that are not working, and I thought that maybe I could report that to 311. So I don't know if that might be an option.
Absolutely report it to 311, but you could also report it to our customer service line. We just have to do a better job of serving our customers and making sure those EV chargers are available at all times. So we want to hear from you, so please let us know.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our discussion. It's been terrific. I think we've all learned something about what the problem is. I think we've really not only acknowledged it, but we've talked about what is the problem relative to under-resourced communities. You know, incentives, we got to redirect those. I keep hearing that one of the themes I hear is speed on every aspect, whether it's in incentives, whether it's building out new alternatives. Speed is incredibly important. I think better communication, better communication to the people that really need it, which are the people that are working 9 to 5 and are not going to be home and around when we knock on their doors during that period of time. A real special effort at educating those folks who are being left out. I'm really pretty excited about the kinds of new things we've talked about. Batteries as a service, that makes sense to me. Solar as an amenity, I've never heard of that, but sign me up. I want one of those. Stackable generators, local generation, all of those things seem to make sense to me and are pretty interesting. So I want to thank you all for participating in this panel. It's really been, I think this is an incredibly important subject. Just transition, solar justice, it's something that we really have to, it's a really important subject that we have to solve, and talking about it among experts with different points of view is a great thing. So once again, I thank you very much. Those of you who are watching or will watch our video, at the end of this will be contact information. And if you want to find out, if you want to see the video, all you have to do is go to NGIN's YouTube channel or go to LinkedIn. We'll post it there as well. And so with that, I want to thank everyone very much and have a great day, or evening, no matter where you are in this fine world.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.